There is a body of water in the desert of the American Southwest that most of the people whose lives depend on it have never seen, and yet it is one of the most important reservoirs on the face of the earth. It sits behind the great concrete wall of Hoover Dam, gathered from the flow of the Colorado River, spread across the desert canyons of the Nevada and Arizona borderlands. A vast inland sea holding trillions of gallons of water in one of the driest places on the continent. It is called Lake Mead, and it is quite simply the keystone of the entire water system of the American West. When it is healthy and full, the cities bloom and the farms flourish, and the taps run across an enormous region. But Lake Mead is not healthy, and it is not full. For more than 2 decades it has been shrinking, its level falling year after year under the relentless pressure of a long drought and a chronic overuse of the river that feeds it, until it has fallen to levels never before seen since the reservoir was first filled. And this has forced upon the West a question that once seemed unthinkable. What happens if Lake Mead dies? If the great reservoir falls so low that it can no longer deliver the water it holds, which states lose their water, and how completely? This is the story of that question. Of the 8 states and entities bound to the fate of Lake Mead and the Colorado River system it anchors, and of the reckoning that awaits a region built upon a river that is running dry. Before we can understand which states would lose their water and in what order, we have to understand what it actually means for Lake Mead to die, because the reality is both more subtle and more frightening than a simple collapse. Lake Mead does not need to vanish entirely, does not need to dry up into a cracked and empty basin in order to die in the sense that matters. The reservoir dies, in the functional sense, when it falls to a level so low that the water it holds can no longer be delivered to the people who depend on it. Hoover Dam works by holding back the water of Lake Mead and releasing it in a controlled way, both to generate the electricity that flows from its turbines and to send water downstream to the cities and farms of the lower Colorado River. But this only works as long as the water in the reservoir stays above certain critical levels. As Lake Mead falls, it approaches first the level at which the dam can no longer generate power, and below that lies the level known as dead pool, the point at which the water is too low to pass through the dam's outlets at all, at which the reservoir can no longer release water downstream. If Lake Mead were to reach dead pool, it would be, in the sense that matters most, dead, its water trapped and undeliverable, the great system it anchors brought to a halt. This is the scenario that gives the question its urgency, not the fantasy of the reservoir vanishing overnight, but the genuine possibility that it could fall to dead pool, that the water could become undeliverable, so that the keystone of the West's water system could functionally fail. And to understand what that would mean for the 8 states, we have to understand how the Colorado River system works, because the order in which the states would lose their water and how completely depends on the geography of where the water comes from and where it goes, and on the century-old body of law that governs who has the right to it. The Colorado River is one of the great rivers of the West, but not in the way that other rivers are great, not a mighty flow of endless abundance, but rather a modest and hard-working river that has been asked to do far more than any river its size could reasonably do. It rises in the high mountains of the Rockies, gathering its water from the snows that fall on the peaks, and flows for well over 1,000 miles down through the canyons and deserts of the Southwest, carving the Grand Canyon along its way, before reaching its delta at the sea. Through the vast network of dams and reservoirs and canals that have been built to harness it, the Colorado River provides water to an enormous region, to 7 states of the United States, and to the country of Mexico across the border, sustaining tens of millions of people and millions of acres of farmland in a region that could never support such a population on its own meager rainfall. The river is divided by the great compacts that govern it into an upper basin and a lower basin, with the dividing line in northern Arizona. And this division is central to understanding how the water flows and who would lose it if the system failed. The upper basin comprises the states where much of the river's water originates, the high country where the snows fall and the tributaries gather, and these are Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. The lower basin comprises the states of the desert Southwest, where much of the water is used, and these are Arizona, Nevada, and California. And beyond the 7 states of the United States, across the international border, lies the 8th of the entities bound to the river, the northern part of Mexico, where the river's water is delivered under long-standing treaty to sustain the cities and farms of the Mexican borderlands, chiefly the state of Baja California, and reaching into Sonora. These are the 8, the 7 of the American Basin and the Mexican borderland state at the end of the line, bound together by their dependence on the Colorado River, and whose fate is tied in different ways and to different degrees to the health of the system that Lake Mead anchors. Here is a crucial point that must be understood, and it concerns the difference between the upper basin and the lower basin, because Lake Mead itself sits in the lower basin, and the water it delivers goes to the lower basin states and to Mexico, the upper basin states, up in the high country where the water originates. Do not draw their water from Lake Mead, because they are upstream of it, taking their water from the river and its tributaries and from their own reservoir, Lake Powell, before the water ever reaches Lake Mead. So in the most literal sense, the death of Lake Mead would strike the lower basin states and Mexico first, and most directly. But it would be a grave mistake to conclude that the upper basin states are therefore safe, because the death of Lake Mead would not be an isolated event but the culmination of a systemic collapse of the entire Colorado River. And the forces that would bring Lake Mead to dead pool would threaten the upper basin as well. Lake Mead is the great symbol and the keystone of the system, and its death would be the clearest expression of a crisis that encompasses the entire basin, upper and lower alike. With all of this understood, we can begin to consider the 8 states, moving through them in the order of their exposure, from those that would lose their water most directly and most completely to those whose exposure is more complex, but no less real. And we begin with the state that is, without any question, the most existentially dependent on Lake Mead of any in the entire system. That state is Nevada. Nevada's dependence on Lake Mead is a thing almost unique in its intensity. Nevada is home to the great metropolitan area of Las Vegas, along with its neighboring cities of Henderson and North Las Vegas, a glittering region of millions of people rising improbably out of the Mojave Desert. And this entire metropolitan area, home to well over 2 million people and host to tens of millions of visitors every year, draws the overwhelming majority of its water directly from Lake Mead. Las Vegas sits just a short distance from the reservoir, and it pumps its water straight out of the lake through intakes built into the reservoir itself. This means Nevada is not merely a user of Colorado River water, but a direct and almost total dependent of Lake Mead specifically, its lifeline reaching straight into the reservoir behind Hoover Dam. If Lake Mead were to die, if it were to fall to dead pool and could no longer deliver its water, Nevada would face an existential crisis unlike that of any other state, because the single reservoir that supplies almost all of its urban water would no longer be able to sustain it. The cruelty of Nevada's position is compounded by the smallness of its share of the river. Of all the states that divide the Colorado River, Nevada holds the smallest allocations, a tiny sliver that reflects decisions made a century ago when Nevada was a sparsely populated desert state, and no one imagined that Las Vegas would grow into the metropolis it has become. This has made Nevada, out of sheer necessity, the most efficient user of Colorado River water in the entire basin, a leader in conservation, recycling nearly all of the water it uses indoors, and returning it to Lake Mead, tearing out lawns and banning ornamental grass, driving its per capita water use to among the lowest in the region. And it has taken extraordinary engineering steps to protect itself, building a new intake deep at the very bottom of Lake Mead, a so-called third straw designed to keep drawing water even if the reservoir falls to catastrophically low levels, far below where the older intakes would fail. These preparations mean Nevada could continue to draw water from Lake Mead even as it approaches dead pool, buying the state a crucial margin of survival. But in the ultimate scenario of the reservoir's death, even these heroic measures would face their limits, and Nevada would be fighting for its very existence. There is a profound irony here, for Las Vegas, a city that symbolizes excess in the popular imagination, has become one of the most water-conscious places in the country, and yet it remains the most exposed of all. A warning that conservation alone cannot save a place if the underlying supply collapses. The second state on our list, and the one whose exposure is in some ways the most alarming when we consider the combination of dependence and vulnerability, is Arizona. Arizona is a desert state of millions of people, home to the great metropolis of Phoenix and the city of Tucson, and it depends heavily on Colorado River water delivered through an enormous canal system, the Central Arizona Project, that carries the water hundreds of miles across the desert from the river to the interior of the state. This canal draws Colorado River water from below Hoover Dam, and so the cities and farms it serves depend ultimately on the health of the system that Lake Mead anchors. But Arizona occupies a uniquely precarious position in the hierarchy of Colorado River water rights. In securing the federal funding to build the Great Canal, Arizona agreed long ago to accept a junior priority for much of that water, subordinating its claim to that of California. This means that when the river runs short and cuts must be made, Arizona absorbs them before the senior users in The consequence of this junior status is that Arizona is, in a very real sense, first in line to lose its Colorado River water as the system declines, even though it is not the state most directly dependent on Lake Mead itself. As the reservoir has fallen and shortages have been declared, it is Arizona that has borne the deepest cuts, its farmers seeing their water deliveries slashed, its cities facing the prospect of reductions. And if Lake Mead were to die, Arizona would face the loss of a major portion of its water at the same time that its junior status would leave it with the least protection. Arizona does have other sources, groundwater above all, which gives it some cushion, but that groundwater is itself a troubled and finite resource, drawn down over generations to the point of sinking the ground and depleting the aquifers. And the arrival of river water was in part a solution to that very problem. If the Colorado River were lost, Arizona would be forced back onto its groundwater, pumping hard once again and accelerating the depletion of a reserve that cannot sustain the state indefinitely. So even Arizona's backup is precarious, and its heavy reliance on the river and its unfavorable place in the priority system make it one of the most exposed of all the states to the death of Lake Mead. The third state on our list is California, and California's position is more complex, for it is at once the largest user of Colorado River water and, in an important sense, the most protected. California draws an enormous quantity of water from the river, more than any other state, water that flows below Hoover Dam and is diverted into great aqueducts that carry it to the vast agricultural region of the Imperial Valley and to the sprawling cities of Southern California, to Los Angeles and San Diego, and the millions of the coastal metropolis. In sheer volume, California has the most to lose, because it uses the most. But California holds some of the most senior water rights on the entire river, rights that place it at the front of the line when the water is divided, and protect it from cuts until the very end. Under the priority system, California's senior rights mean that it would be among the last to lose its Colorado River water, not the first, shielded by the seniority of its claims even as junior users like Arizona are cut. This does not mean that California is safe, for the death of Lake Mead would still be a catastrophe for the state. The Imperial Valley, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the country, depends almost entirely on Colorado River water, and it holds some of the most senior rights of all, so senior that the farms of the valley have a stronger claim than the millions of people of Los Angeles. The cities of Southern California depend on the river for a significant share of their water, and while they have other sources, the loss of the Colorado River would strain them severely. So California would suffer greatly from the death of Lake Mead, losing an enormous quantity of water in absolute terms. But its senior rights and its diversified supplies mean that it would be more protected than Nevada or Arizona, and later in line to be cut. Its position on our list, third, reflects this dual reality that it has the most to lose in volume, but the most protection in law, a giant that would be wounded but not destroyed as quickly as its more exposed neighbors. Having considered the three states of the lower basin, we now turn to the four states of the upper basin, and here the story changes. Because these states do not draw their water from Lake Mead, but from the river and its tributaries, and from Lake Powell, upstream of Lake Mead. Their exposure to the death of Lake Mead is therefore less direct, but it is real nonetheless. Because the death of Lake Mead would be a symptom of a systemic collapse that would threaten the whole river, and because the upper basin is bound to the lower basin by the compacts that govern the river, obligations that could force the upper basin to send water downstream even as its own supplies dwindle. The fourth state on our list, and the largest user of the river among the upper basin states, is Colorado. Colorado is, in a sense, the birthplace of the river, for it is in its high mountains that much of the river's water originates, gathered from the snows that fall on the peaks. The state depends heavily on the river and its tributaries for its own water, and it is the largest consumer of the river's water among the upper basin states. Colorado's exposure to the death of Lake Mead is not the direct exposure of a state that draws from the reservoir, but rather the systemic exposure of a state bound to a river in crisis. If the whole system were collapsing to the point that Lake Mead reached dead pool, it would mean the river had been pushed to its limits, and Colorado, as the largest upper basin user, would be caught up in the reckoning. The compacts that govern the river obligate the upper basin to deliver a certain amount of water to the lower basin, an obligation that does not disappear when the river runs short, and in a severe and sustained crisis. Meeting that obligation could force painful reductions on the upper basin states, Colorado chief among them. The fifth state on our list is Utah, another of the upper basin states, which draws on the Colorado River and its tributaries for a significant part of its water. Utah is one of the fastest growing states in the country, and it has ambitions to draw even more water from the river to sustain its growth. Ambitions that collide directly with the reality of a shrinking river that cannot meet the demands already placed upon it. Utah's exposure, like Colorado's, is the systemic exposure of an upper basin state bound to a river in crisis. And its growth makes it particularly vulnerable, because its plans depend on water that may simply not be there. If Lake Mead were to die, signaling the collapse of the system, Utah would face the frustration of its ambitions and pressure on its existing supplies. The sixth state on our list is Wyoming, the northernmost of the upper basin states, which draws on the upper tributaries of the Colorado River system for its water, sustaining its ranching and its agriculture. Wyoming is a smaller user of the river than Colorado or Utah, with a more limited dependence, but it is bound to the same system and the same compacts, and it shares in the systemic exposure of the upper basins. If the river system were collapsing to the point of Lake Mead's death, Wyoming too would be caught up in the crisis, bound by the same obligations that tie all the upper basin states to the fate of the whole. The seventh state on our list is New Mexico, which draws on the Colorado River system through the river's tributaries and through infrastructure that carries Colorado River water across the divide to sustain part of the state, including areas around its largest population centers. New Mexico is a dry state dependent on careful management of scarce water, and its share of the river, while modest, is important to it. As an upper basin state bound to the compacts, New Mexico shares in the systemic exposure of the upper basin, and the death of Lake Mead would threaten its supplies and its obligations, another of the upper basin states tied to a river whose crisis would touch them all. And the eighth of the entities on our list, the one that lies beyond the borders of the United States, but is no less bound to the fate of the Colorado River, is Mexico, and specifically the Mexican border state of Baja California, along with the reach of the river's water into Sonora. Under a long-standing treaty between the United States and Mexico, a share of the Colorado River's water is delivered across the border to Mexico, where it sustains the cities and farms of the Mexican borderlands, chief among them the city of Tijuana and the agricultural region around Mexicali. Mexico sits at the very end of the Colorado River system, downstream of everything else, the last to receive the water after all the upstream users have taken their share. This position at the end of the line makes Mexico acutely vulnerable, because it receives what is left after everyone else, and in a severe shortage, its deliveries could be squeezed to almost nothing. So much of the river's water is now taken before it reaches the border that in most years, the river no longer reaches the sea at all, its once great delta reduced to a dry and cracked expanse. If Lake Mead were to die and the system to collapse, the water reaching Mexico would be among the first to disappear entirely, leaving the border cities and the farms of the Mexicali Valley without the supply that sustains them. A catastrophe at the end of a river that would have already failed everyone upstream. Having considered all 8 of the states and entities bound to the Colorado River, it is worth stepping back to grasp the full magnitude of what the death of the reservoir would mean. We are speaking of a system that sustains tens of millions of people across 7 American states and into Mexico, that irrigates millions of acres of some of the most productive farmland in the world, that supports an entire civilization built in the desert on the strength of a single river. The death of Lake Mead would strike at the foundation of all of this, threatening the water supply of an enormous region, devastating the agriculture that feeds much of the nation, and forcing a reckoning with the limits of the desert that the West has spent a century avoiding. It would be one of the greatest resource catastrophes in the history of the country, a collapse whose consequences would ripple far beyond the 8 states directly bound to the river, into the food supply and the economy of the entire nation. It is important, having painted this alarming picture, to be clear and honest about the likelihood of the scenario, because the point of contemplating the death of Lake Mead is not to predict an imminent catastrophe, but to understand the stakes and the vulnerability that the crisis reveals. Lake Mead has fallen to alarming lows, lower than ever before in its history, and the possibility of it reaching deadpool has been genuinely contemplated and feared. But the region is fighting hard to prevent that outcome, through emergency cuts, through negotiations among the states, through the release of extra water from upstream reservoirs, and through conservation on a large scale. These efforts, combined with a few better winters, have pulled Lake Mead back from the very edge, offering a reprieve from the most immediate danger. The death of Lake Mead is not imminent, and it may never come to pass if the region succeeds in bringing its use of the river into balance with what the river can provide. But the reprieve is fragile and temporary, and the underlying crisis, the fundamental imbalance between the demands on the river and its shrinking flow, has not been resolved. The root of the crisis lies in an imbalance built into the Colorado River system from its very beginning. When the water of the river was divided among the states a century ago, the division was based on measurements of the river's flow that turned out to be far too optimistic, taken during an unusually wet period and promising more water than the river actually carries in normal times. The result is that the states were granted rights to more water than the river reliably provides, a structural deficit baked into the system from the start. For decades, this deficit was hidden, masked by the enormous reserves stored in the great reservoirs, which could be drawn down to cover the difference. But as the drought deepened and the years of overuse accumulated, the reservoirs were steadily emptied until they fell to the alarming lows of recent years. The death of Lake Mead, were it to come, would be the ultimate expression of this imbalance, the moment when the hidden deficit could no longer be papered over and the river's true limits were laid bare. This imbalance has been made worse by the warming of the climate. As temperatures rise across the basin, the flow of the Colorado River has declined. Warmer air draws more moisture from the soil and vegetation, so that less of the precipitation makes its way into the river. The mountain snowpack that is the ultimate source of much of the river's water melts earlier and yields less, and more water is lost to evaporation from the warming land and from the surfaces of the reservoirs themselves. The result is that the river carries less water than it once did and is likely to carry still less in the future. The warming climate means that the crisis is not a temporary drought that will simply end, but a long-term shift toward a drier river, which makes the death of Lake Mead a more serious and enduring threat than a mere dry spell would pose. There is a deeper lesson in all of this. The West built an extraordinary civilization in the desert, cities and farms flourishing in a place that could never have supported them on its own meager rainfall. All of it made possible by the capture and distribution of the water of the Colorado River. But that triumph rested on an assumption that the water would always be there, that the reserves were inexhaustible, that the fundamental imbalance between supply and demand could be ignored, because the reservoirs would always cover it. The crisis of Lake Mead is the unraveling of that assumption, the moment when the buffer that hid the imbalance for so long finally began to run out, revealing the unsustainable reality that had been there all along. It is a reminder that no reserve is infinite, that a civilization cannot indefinitely take more from a river than the river provides. So the death of Lake Mead, were it to come, would be a catastrophe for all 8 of the states and entities bound to the Colorado River, though it would strike them in different ways and in a different order. It would strike Nevada first, and most existentially, the state whose great metropolis draws almost all its water directly from the reservoir. It would strike Arizona nearly as hard. The state whose junior priority places it first in line to lose its Colorado River water. It would strike California grievously in volume, though its senior rights would protect it longer. It would strike the upper-basin states, Colorado and Utah and Wyoming and New Mexico, through the systemic collapse of the river to which they are bound, even though they do not draw from Lake Mead directly. And it would strike Mexico at the very end of the line, its borderland cities and farms facing the loss of the water that sustains them after everyone upstream has already failed. The 8 states are bound together by a single river and a single reservoir, their fates intertwined in a way that most of their inhabitants scarcely appreciate. The death of that reservoir is the specter that haunts them all, the catastrophe that the region is fighting to prevent. Whether it comes to pass depends on whether the states can do the hard and unprecedented work of bringing their use of the river into balance with what the river can provide, before the reservoir falls to the level at which it can no longer sustain them. It is a test of cooperation and foresight and sacrifice, one that the region has so far struggled to pass, and the stakes could not be higher. For the water of tens of millions of people and the fate of an entire civilization in the desert hang in the balance. Lake Mead will, most likely, go on holding its water and delivering it to the states that depend on it, its death prevented by the efforts of a region that cannot afford to let it die. But the reservoir has fallen lower than ever before, and the river that feeds it is shrinking, and the question of what would happen if it died is no longer a fantasy but a scenario that the West has genuinely had to contemplate. The 8 states bound to its fate are living, whether they know it or not, in the shadow of that question. And the answer to the question, the ranking of who would lose their water, and how completely, is a map of the vulnerability of the American West, a hierarchy of exposure that runs from the direct dependence of Lake Mead in Nevada and Arizona, to the great senior user in California, to the upper-basin states bound by the compacts, and finally to Mexico at the end of the river. It is a map worth studying, not because the catastrophe is certain, but because understanding the vulnerability it reveals is the first step toward addressing the crisis that could one day make it real. The death of Lake Mead is the warning written in the falling water and the exposed shorelines that mark how far the reservoir has dropped. A warning that the water that made the modern West possible is finite and precious and can no longer be taken for granted.